By the end of the 19th century, the triumph of the Copernican system seemed complete. Only one tiny detail had eluded the experimenters. Physics at the time, including Maxwell's famous equations for electrodynamics, was based on the assumption that space was filled with a substance, an ether through which light and other electromagnetic waves would propagate. But all attempts to directly measure the motion of the Earth around the Sun through this ether had paradoxically resulted in an apparent velocity of 0. The stage was set for one of the most important events in the history of physics, the Michelson-Morley experiment.
1887 Michelson-Morley experiment. If the Earth were moving through an ether, then a sort of ether wind would be created at the surface of the Earth. A light beam projected directly into this ether wind would be expected to move slower than a light beam projected across the ether wind. If we project the beams across a known distance and then recombine them, we would expect the two waves to be out of phase by an amount that would tell us the distance the Earth had moved.
If the Earth is moving through the ether, then light waves going one direction relative to us should travel at a different speed than another direction. It's like if you're in a fast-moving river and you're swimming along with the current, you're swimming much faster relative to the shore than if you're swimming against the current. So what the Michelson-Morley experiment was designed to do was measure the speed of light in one direction versus another direction to see how fast we're moving through the ether. And what it discovered was it's the same in one direction as the other.
Michelson-Morley couldn't measure any effect of Earth's orbit, even though the assumption was at the time that that would affect the measured speed of light.
The experiment failed to detect the Earth moving in or against the ether. The problem was serious. Although various solutions were advanced, in the end, science was faced with a choice. Either discard the ether or admit that the Earth wasn't orbiting the Sun. It was Albert Einstein who came up with the solution, which now forms the basis of our physics.
In 1887, an experiment shattered the scientific community. Michelson and Morley tried to check the speed of the Earth through the ether as it orbited the Sun by passing light in two directions, one in the direction of the Earth's travel and one at right angles, and then comparing them for differences. They expected to measure a speed of about 30 kilometers per second. To their amazement, there was no movement of this order. They called it a null result. They actually measured 1 to 10 kilometers per second, but it was still called a null result. They rushed out the theory called the Fitzgerald-Lorentz Contraction. This claimed that the tube in line with the direction of movement shortens as it moves through the ether. There was no evidence whatsoever for this. It was only a way of getting over the implication that the Earth was stationary. Later, in 1905 and 1915, Einstein produced his relativity theories, which overcame the troublesome Michelson-Morley experiment by simply abolishing the ether. The whole theory is riddled with contradictions and problems. In 1913, Sagnac carried out a simple experiment of passing light in opposite directions around a table and recombining them. This produced interference fringes. He then rotated the whole table at 2 revolutions per second and found that the fringes changed. This result has very significant implications in science. It works as follows. A beam of light leaves the light source at the bottom left-hand corner and is split into 2 different beams, which we have coloured red and blue just to distinguish them. They travel round the circuit in opposite directions until they eventually reach the splitter, which also recombines them. There they then go on to the photographic plate, where they have interference fringes. In this simplified version, we see that the beam is split into two, the red and the blue again, and they go round the circuit and are recombined at the splitter and recombining prism, so that they again produce the fringes on the photographic plate. Now let us rotate the table. Before we do so, there is the very important subject of the effect of the ether. The Mitchellson-Morley experiment failed to detect the 30 kilometers per second motion of the Earth through the ether. So as to overcome this problem, Einstein simply abolished the ether in his relativity theory. The very significant result of the Sagnac experiment was that it proved that the ether existed. Let us see how it did this. It is a fundamental feature of relativity that it claims that as there is no ether, light travels away from a source at the same speed relative to the source, whether the source is moving or not. Thus, whether the table is turning or not, the fringe patterns should stay the same. But if the ether exists, once the light has left the source, the speed of the light is controlled by the ether, independent of the speed of the table, mirrors, etc., as we see here. So let us see what happens when we rotate the table. Here, the light is split, and the red and blue lights go in opposite directions. But notice that the left-hand mirror has moved around in such a direction that the distance the red light has to travel is further. Now in relativity, the same time should be taken because the splitter is also moving and the distance between them is the same. But now imagine that the ether exists and the speed of the light is controlled by the stationary ether. Imagine the ether like a thick treacle that limits how fast the light can travel, independent of the motion of the light source, the splitter, or the mirrors. The result is that the red light takes longer to reach the left-hand mirror. Similarly, the right-hand mirror is coming towards the blue light, so it reaches the mirror quicker. After they change ends, the red light again takes longer to reach the recombiner, whilst the blue light gets there quicker again. So they reach the photographic plate with a delay between them, and this changes the fringe pattern. In fact, Sagnac, using the speed of the rotation of the table, calculated how much the fringes should change, and found that they did change by just that amount. The crucial feature of this experiment is that it demonstrates that the ether does exist, which demolishes relativity. How does the scientific establishment deal with this result? By muddying the waters with scientific gobbledygook. Wikipedia says, in the above discussion, the rotation mentioned is a rotation with respect to an inertial reference frame. Since this experiment does not involve a relativistic velocity, the same wording is valid both in the context of classical electrodynamics and special relativity. How on earth can it be valid in both theories? It clearly proves that the ether exists because the speed of the light is controlled by the ether, independent of the rotating table and mirrors. This Sagnac effect is used by airlines for their compass directions. As the plane turns, the change in the fringes are translated into a change in the direction of the plane that then registers on the cockpit compass. If a telescope is pointing at a star and both are stationary, then obviously the light comes straight into the telescope. In 1729, Bradley found that he had to tip his telescope forward very slightly to get a star in the center of his telescope. It was assumed that this was due to the motion of the Earth around the Sun. Let us assume that the telescope was moving at 5 miles an hour and had to be tipped 5 degrees. This 5-degree tipping, however, could equally be caused by the ether moving at 5 miles an hour, carrying the stars around the Earth. As we see here, the light would be coming in at the same angle, and the telescope would still have to be tipped 5 degrees. So tipping the telescope does not tell us whether it is the starlight moving or the telescope moving. However, there is a simple experiment that can determine whether it was the Earth that was moving or the ether and starlight. All that you had to do was record the tipping required for any particular star, then fill the telescope with water, which greatly slows down the speed of light in the telescope. So here is the moving telescope filled with water, tipped at 5 degrees, and you can see that the starlight does not now reach the eyepiece at the bottom. This is because the starlight moves much more slowly when passing through water. However, if the telescope is tipped further, say 10 degrees, then the starlight will then be visible again in the eyepiece. It has to be tipped further because the light is now slower when in the telescope. But if the starlight is going past the telescope at 5 miles an hour, then when it is filled with water, no further tipping is needed because the light is coming in at 5 degrees anyway. The starlight stays on the same path but is only travelling slower in the water. To recap, if it is the telescope that is moving, then when it is filled with water, it has to be tipped further to see the star. If the telescope is stationary and the starlight drifting past us, then it does not have to be tipped further. In 1871, George Biddle Airy, the Astronomer Royal, performed this experiment. This is a copy from his original report. You can see that the two readings are virtually identical. If it had been the telescope that was moving, Airy expected a figure of 30 seconds of arc. In fact, he only managed to read 0.8 seconds of arc difference. Bradley first discovered stellar aberration, and it is interesting that in his report Airy mentions that it was now about 100 seconds of arc and that it was still slowly diminishing. This indicates that the speed of light was still decreasing in measurable amounts when Airy performed his experiment in 1871. The result of Airy's experiment, known as Airy's failure, was that the telescope does not have to be tipped further. This proved that it was the incoming light that was moving past a stationary telescope fixed to the stationary Earth. What is interesting in his very brief report of only 4 pages is that not once did he refer to the astonishing results that the experiment proved, that the Earth was stationary. This experiment was also dismissed by Wikipedia, which said, Ether drag test, under the main article, Luminiferous Ether. By means of a water-filled telescope, Airy in 1871 looked for a change in stellar aberration through the refracting water due to an ether drag. Like in all other ether drift experiments, he obtained a negative result. This is a gross distortion of the truth. That he did not have to change the angle proved that it was the ether drifting past the stationary surface of the Earth. This experiment is never taught to university science students. They might begin to question what they were being taught about the cosmos, the universe, the Big Bang, evolution, and much else, if it was realized that the Earth really is at the center of the universe, which is rotating around us.
Scientific proof the Earth does not move. Many attempts were made to prove that heliocentricity was true and geocentricity was false. Every such attempt has been a failure. The most famous, because of its precision and irrefutability, was the experiment done by physicist A. Mitchellson, 1852 through 1931, and chemist E. W. Morley, 1838 through 1923. The Mitchellson-Morley experiment, using an interferometer which measured light rays, established that the Earth is stationary. Mitchellson was involved in other experiments that confirmed, to his dismay, that the Earth is stationary. The Mitchellson-Morley experiment, 1887, does not stand alone. It is joined in its confirmation of a stationary Earth by the James Bradley experiment, 1729, proving that the ether is not carried along by the Earth, the Sagnac experiment, 1913, proving that there was in fact an ether, the Mitchellson-Gale experiment, 1925, proving that the ether passed over the Earth once every 24 hours, and Airy's failure, 1871, proving that the stars moved, carried by the ether, while the Earth remained stationary. There are many other experiments that have each time given results that were not only consistent with a stationary Earth, but indicative of a stationary Earth. From the light polarization experiments of E. Muscart in 1872 to the mutual inductance experiments of Theodore de Coudres in 1889 to the 1903 Teuton-Noble experiments. Indeed, there is not a single experiment that proves that the Earth moves. The moving Earth is based entirely on a theory and is contradicted by all of the experimental evidence. The Sagnac experiment, proving the existence of ether, destroys the theory of relativity, which necessarily assumes that there is no ether. The Mitchellson-Gale experiment proved that the ether passed over the Earth once every 24 hours, but it did not prove whether it was the ether moving or the Earth spinning. Airy's failure determined with scientific certainty that in fact it was the ether carrying the stars that was moving over the Earth, and that the Earth was stationary. Dr. Neville Thomas Jones, Ph.D., explains that George Airy proved that the world was stationary and the stars are moving. Because his experiment proved that the Earth does not move, which was the opposite of the expected outcome, Airy's experiment is commonly known as Airy's failure. There has been a virtual blackout, however, within science education of these experiments. Dr. Malcolm Bowden reveals that he asked 3 Christian physicists if they had ever heard of them. Not one had. Indeed, in March 2005, another physicist wrote to Dr. Bowden that, quote, "After 35 years as a professional physicist with a thesis in relativity, I only learned of Sagnac's experiment last year." Close quote. The degree of the cover-up of true science is simply astounding. The Mitchellson-Morley experiment was simple in concept. A light beam was split. One of the split beams was sent at a right angle to the Earth's supposed direction of travel, and the other was sent along the path of the Earth's supposed direction of travel. The light traveling in the direction of the Earth's travel should have taken longer than the light traveling at right angles to the Earth's direction of travel. To the amazement of the scientific world, the results were null, meaning that there was no difference in the speed of the light beams. That meant that the Earth was motionless. The Mitchellson-Morley experiment shook the scientific world. The implications were devastating for the Copernican model of a globular, spinning Earth orbiting around the sun. If the heliocentric model fell, then evolution would not be far behind. The priests of science knew that something had to be done if they were going to maintain their godless religion. In desperation, the priests of science tried to explain away the null result of the Mitchellson-Morley experiment. Hendrik A. Lorentz and George Fitzgerald swallowed their pride and put their formerly good names to a ridiculous theory that the null result in the Mitchellson-Morley experiment was because the solid steel arm that was pointed in the direction of the supposed motion of the Earth became shorter due to the Earth's movement through the ether. That shortening of the steel caused the light to arrive at the same time, not because the Earth was stationary, but because the Earth was moving. Seriously, I'm not making this up. This supposed contraction became known as the Lorentz Fitzgerald contraction. There was absolutely no evidence to support the theory of the Lorentz Fitzgerald contraction, but it was all they had to try to keep the spinning and orbiting Earth model of heliocentricity alive. They only came up with the theory of the Lorentz Fitzgerald contraction because they had nothing else to explain the null result, and they were not going to abandon the Copernican model. Some scientists aver that it is a misnomer to call the Lorentz Fitzgerald theory a contraction, since as first theorized, it was supposedly the transverse arm of the Mitchellson-Morley interferometer that was lengthened, so it should actually be called the Lorentz Fitzgerald expansion. Regardless, if it was called an expansion or a contraction, it was an inane theory that was unsupported by any proof. Arthur Miller described the Lorentz Fitzgerald contraction as physics of desperation. Indeed, it was more akin to a fairy tale for adults than it was science. It was not long before Einstein was pressed into service with his theory of relativity. Notice that the scientific community rejected acceptance of a stationary Earth, not because there was any scientific evidence that contradicted it, but because it had become the central faith of the godless scientific community. The Copernican theory was simply not to be abandoned, no matter what the scientific evidence showed. Einstein to the rescue. Something had to be done about the results of the Mitchellson-Morley experiment. The high priests of science simply could not allow the world to discover that the Earth did not move. Enter Albert Einstein and his theory of relativity. Einstein announced his special theory of relativity in 1905 and his general theory of relativity in 1915. Einstein's theory of relativity was able to explain away the null results of the Mitchellson-Morley experiment. According to Einstein, the speed of light is constant, and consequently, an object moving through space would not show movement if light was used to measure the speed of the motion. According to Einstein, the speed of light is constant for every observer, no matter what speed the observer is traveling. Armed with the theory of relativity, scientists argued that the Earth was moving despite the null result of the Mitchellson-Morley experiment. They alleged that it was incorrectly shown not to be moving in the Mitchellson-Morley experiment because the light used in the experiment, which was expected to show the speed of the Earth through the ether, could neither increase nor decrease in speed. The Mitchellson-Morley experiment was designed to measure the expected speed of the supposedly moving Earth through the ether. Einstein could not have a constant speed of light, as he theorized, if there was an ether. Einstein solved that issue by simply announcing that there was no ether. Einstein, by theorizing that there is a constant speed of light and there is no ether, solved the Mitchellson-Morley null movement result and saved the heliocentric model of an orbiting, rotating Earth. Light travels in waves, which is a fact that Einstein accepted. A wave needs a medium through which to travel. Imagine a wave in water without the water. It is an impossibility. The medium through which light travels is called ether. The simple law of physics that a wave needs a medium through which to travel is something that is easy to understand. The corollary of an ether for light to travel through, however, will seem foreign to the reader because it is not taught in schools. The educational system has been given over completely to the mystical theory of relativity, where the ether is simply not allowed to exist. Einstein removed the ether from existence by edict. The problem is that a wave of light cannot exist without a medium for that light. Professor Herbert Dingle explains the absurdity of light waves without an ether through which to travel. Light consisted of vibrations in that ether that had physical properties which also were, in principle, determinable. What Einstein was proposing, therefore, was to retain the finite velocity of light without the existence of any standard with respect to which that velocity had a meaning. Light consisted of waves with a definite length, frequency, and velocity in nothing. It was the grin without the Cheshire cat. The physical part of the theory was expendable. Only the equations needed to be saved. Einstein saw a way of saving the equations and did not consider it worthwhile to, quote, explain light. Einstein was satisfied to, quote, explain it in terms of things that we understood nothing of. In other words, not to explain it at all. If his assumptions were granted, he did save the equations. And when his theory ultimately made its general impact on the world, mathematics had so dominated physics that the non-existence of the Cheshire cat was regarded as a triviality. The grin remained, and all was well. Einstein's construct of, quote, no ether, close quote, is an impossibility, just as a wave in water without the water is an impossibility. In any event, Einstein was proven wrong, and the ether was proven to exist in the 1913 Sagnac experiment. That experiment proves scientifically, beyond any doubt, that there is in fact an ether through which light travels. Indeed, airlines today use cockpit, ring, laser, gyroscopic compasses that are based upon the discovery by George Sagnac of fringe changes in light traveling through the ether. The changes in the fringes of light is then computed into a reading which tells the pilot about changes in bearing of the airplane. Without an ether, those sophisticated optical compasses would not work at all. The very existence of the laser gyroscopic compasses used by airplanes today proves that there is an ether and impeaches Einstein's claim that there is no ether. The existence of ether destroys the theory of relativity and establishes the Mitchellson-Morley experiment as proving that the Earth is stationary. Einstein removed the ether, which upended the traditional laws of physics. Einstein did not present any proof that there was no ether. He just made it up. Removing the ether was a way of explaining why Mitchellson-Morley's interferometer showed no motion of the Earth. Removing the ether removed the resistance of ether to light waves, which allowed Einstein to conjure the myth that light will not change speed on a moving surface. That explained away the Mitchellson-Morley results, showing that Earth did not move. If, however, there is an ether, that necessarily means that the Earth is stationary, as proven in the Mitchellson-Morley experiment. The theory of relativity is a complete lie. It is based entirely on convoluted and deceptive mathematical models. Nikola Tesla's statement about the modern methods of scientists like Einstein is revealing. Quote, "Today's scientists have substituted mathematics for experiments, and they wander off through equation after equation and eventually build a structure which has no relation to reality." Close quote. Professor Herbert Dingle was once an eminent proponent of the theory of relativity. He later realized that it was simply a myth, supported not by scientific experiments, but rather by false math formulae. He discovered that the theory of relativity is held to be true not because it is true, but because mathematical formulae were devised and held up as evidence of its truth. Quote, "Not only are hypotheses held to contain the, quote, real truth, it is now claimed that any mathematical hypothesis is necessarily true." The problem with basing proof for a scientific theory solely on mathematics is that a mathematical equation may not correspond to reality. A mathematical formula may only prove something that is imaginary and not real. Professor Dingle explains, quote, "The symbols that compose a mathematical expression may, with equal mathematical correctness, correspond both to that which is observable and that which is purely imaginary, or even unimaginable. If, therefore, we start with a mathematical expression and infer that there must be something in nature corresponding to it, we do in principle just what the pre-scientific philosophers did when they assumed that nature must obey their axioms. But its immensely greater power for both good and evil makes the consequences of its misapplication immensely more serious." The experiments supporting the theory of relativity were, quote, "thought experiments," performed completely through complicated math formulae designed to bedazzle ignorant laymen. Professor Dingle stated, "Mathematics has been transformed from the servant of experience into its master, and instead of enabling the full implications and potentialities of the facts of experience to be realized and amplified, it has been held necessarily to symbolize truths which are in fact sheer impossibilities, but are presented to the layman as discoveries." Dr. Dingle reveals the key point that is the cornerstone of the theory of relativity. Many highfalutin scientists do not seem to know this one simple fact. Quote, "In the language of mathematics, we can tell lies as well as truths. And within the scope of mathematics itself, there is no possible way of telling one from the other. That is the dirty secret behind the theory of relativity. Einstein used mathematics to tell lies. The only way to determine if a mathematical formula has any validity is to test it in the real world. Dr. Dingle explains that, quote, "We can distinguish them only by experience or by reasoning outside the mathematics, applied to the possible relation between the mathematical solution and its supposed physical correlate. Physical experiments are not something that have been done with much success in proving the theory of relativity. Consequently, scientists resort to thought experiments using mathematical formulae which have no correlation to reality. How can math be used to tell lies, as alleged by Professor Dingle? A simple example will illustrate how math can be used to support a falsehood. If one were to say that a glass that is half empty is the same as a glass that is half full, that would be true. One can use mathematics, however, to make that simple truth be the foundation for a falsehood. Let's put the half-full glass equaling the half-empty glass into an equation, where E represents an empty glass and F represents a full glass. 1/2 E equals 1/2 F. That equation, 1/2 E equals 1/2 F, is accurate as it is presented. A half-empty glass is equal to a half-full glass. Now, in basic algebra, if one multiplies both sides by the same number, it does not affect the accuracy of the equation. Thus, to multiply both sides of the equation by 2, one would get the result of E equals F. Under the rules of algebra, that is supposed to be a true statement. We know, however, that in reality, an empty glass does not equal a full glass. Thus, in reality, E does not equal F. However, mathematics can be used to present a falsehood as truth. E equals F. That is the type of unreal reasoning that permeates the theory of relativity, where the scientific testing is done in thought experiments using mathematics. This creates a fantasy world of relativity. The theory of relativity is not science. It is mysticism, supported only by mathematical models. Physicists gave up trying to understand the absurd results of the formulae used to explain the theory of relativity and simply capitulated without much of a fight. They accepted the mathematical formulae of Einstein, even though they often gave inaccurate and incongruous solutions. Dingle explains that, quote, with the apparent success in 1919 of Einstein's general theory with its then quite new and terrifying mathematical machinery of tensor calculus, came the fatal climax. Physicists gave up trying to understand the whole business and surrendered the use of their intelligence and accepted passively whatever apparent absurdities the mathematicians put before them. Einstein's biographer, Ronald Clark, reports that Einstein's friend, Janos Plech, suggested to Einstein that there seemed to be some connection between mathematics and fiction. Einstein replied, quote, there may be something in what you say. When I examine myself and my methods of thought, I come to the conclusion that the gift of fantasy has meant more to me than my talent for absorbing positive knowledge. Close quote. The theory of relativity is not science. It is fantasy conjured by mathematical formulae in the minds of Einstein and his followers. The blind faith of the scientific community in the supposed truth of the theory of relativity and its intolerance for any evidence of its invalidity is akin to adherence in a religious cult. When one realizes that relativity is more a religion than it is science, it explains why the ascension of relativity is in direct proportion to the descent of Christianity in society. It seems that there is more tolerance in religion than there is in the scientific community toward heterodoxy, especially when it comes to the theory of relativity. Indeed, Professor Dingle said as much. Quote, "It is ironical that in the very field in which science has claimed superiority to theology, for example, in the abandoning of dogma and the granting of absolute freedom to criticism, the positions are now reversed. Science will not tolerate criticism of special relativity, while theology talks freely about the death of God, religionless Christianity, and so on which I make no comment whatever. Unless scientists can be awakened to the situation into which they have lapsed, the future of science and civilization is black indeed." Charles Lane Poor, professor of celestial mechanics at Columbia University and the author of a number of standard textbooks on astronomy, stated that, quote, "The relativity theory strikes directly at our fundamental concepts as to the structure of the universe. Its conclusions are startling and completely upsetting to our common sense way of looking at physical and astronomical phenomena." Close quote. Dr. Louis Essen, a distinguished mathematician and fellow of the Royal Society, stated that the theory of relativity was not truly a physical theory, but rather simply a number of sometimes contradictory assumptions. Lord Ernest Rutherford is considered the father of nuclear physics. So eminent was he that chemical element 104 was named Rutherfordium after him. Lord Rutherford has called the theory of relativity simply, quote, nonsense. In 1922, Professor Herbert Dingle wrote Relativity for All, one of the first standard textbooks on the theory of relativity. His second book on the subject, written approximately 20 years later, The Special Theory of Relativity, remained for a long time the standard work in English in American universities on the theory of relativity. Indeed, Professor Dingle was one of the foremost experts on the theory of relativity in the world. During a span of 50 years, he studied the theory intensively and conferred about it with all the physicists who were experts in it. Einstein, Eddington, Tolman, Whittaker, Schrödinger, Born, and Bridgman. So renowned was Dingle's expertise on the theory of relativity that when Einstein died in 1955, the BBC chose Professor Dingle to broadcast a tribute to Einstein. In 1959, after years of believing and promoting the theory of relativity, Dingle realized that something was wrong. He found a paradox in the theory of relativity. He spent 13 years canvassing his large network of scientists to try to find an answer to the paradox. Nobody could answer the paradox. He tried to publish the paradox, but was refused all access to scientific journals. Finally, in 1972, Dingle decided to publish his conclusion in a book titled Science at the Crossroads. He explained in his book that he only published it because he was denied access to scientific journals to present his evidence. In that book, Professor Dingle presents unimpeachable proof that the theory of relativity is invalid.